Hey guys, what's up? I'm Erin and welcome back to the channel. If you've ever heard the stat that only 41% of Americans can afford a $1,000 emergency, chances are it's made you feel a little bit uneasy. And this is one of the most cited headlines in personal finance. And it paints a pretty grim picture. But what if that number doesn't actually mean what we think it means? Today, let's break down Bankrate's emergency savings report, what the numbers say, and importantly, what they don't say, and why these headlines may be doing more harm than good. Each year, Bankrate releases its emergency savings report, a survey supposedly designed to gauge Americans' readiness for an unexpected emergency expense, namely a $1,000 emergency expense in the form of, say, an ER visit or a car repair. In the 2025 report, only 41% of Americans said they would cover that $1,000 expense using savings. The other 59% said they'd use a credit card, reduce spending in other areas, borrow from family or friends, or take out a loan, or even use some other payment method. That's incredibly striking, and understandably, the minute Bankrate publishes this annual survey, headlines light up across the internet. But the thing is, these headlines tend to oversimplify the data. And the truth of the matter is, this survey doesn't measure what people think it measures. Let's look at the actual question Bankrate asks. Which of the following best describes how you would deal with a major unexpected expense, such as $1,000 for an emergency room visit or car repair? And the options are: pay from savings, use a credit card and pay it off over time, reduce spending on other things, borrow from friends or family, take out a personal loan, and other. On the surface, this seems like a solid question. It's simple, it's direct, but let's talk about what this question is asking and, importantly, what it's not asking. It's not asking, do you have a way to comfortably cover a $1,000 emergency expense? It's not asking, would an expense like this derail your budget or push you into debt? And it's absolutely not asking about financial readiness. What this survey is asking is about payment preferences and how people would choose to cover this expense. And that is not always a measure of financial preparedness or financial readiness. Someone might choose to use a credit card even if they have the cash or savings simply for points or convenience. Others might choose to cash flow this expense from their regular budget or to put it on a debit card. It doesn't mean they can't handle this emergency expense. It means that they can't answer appropriately within the survey's narrow framing guidelines. Here's where this gets misleading. I'll speak from personal experience. I have a fully funded emergency savings account, but I wouldn't use it to fund a $1,000 unexpected emergency. I might just cash flow it, or in reality, I'd probably just put it on a credit card simply because that's convenient, and then I'd pay it off at the end of the month. So if I answered this survey honestly, I might check credit card or other, but then based on Bankrate's framing, I'd be lumped into the 59% of Americans who supposedly are unprepared for an emergency. That's a problem because this survey doesn't measure strictly if people have the money to cover an expense. What it measures is how they prefer to pay for an expense, and those are not the same thing. If someone decides to put this expense on a credit card and then pay it off, or they simply cash flow it, or they take it from a checking account, if they're taking it from a place that's not labeled savings account, but it's not a sign of financial frailty, it could be smart money management. But this survey doesn't quite capture this nuance. Here's the real question we should be asking. What percentage of people can absorb a $1,000 financial shock without going into debt, selling assets, or jeopardizing their long-term financial plan? That's a very different question than asking if somebody would take money from a very specific account, and how someone chooses to pay for an expense doesn't say whether or not they can afford it. And until we start asking better questions, we're just going to get oversimplified answers. So this survey absolutely falls short in a couple of areas. One, it measures behavior, not ability. Again, it doesn't tell us who can afford a $1,000 emergency. It tells us how they prefer to pay for it, and those are different things. For some people, they don't touch their savings account unless they absolutely have to, and they simply may have other payment preference methods. And again, that is not a sign of being in a fragile state financially. It also ignores how people think about their money. Many Americans have an emergency fund in spirit, so to speak. It's just not labeled emergency fund, or it's not labeled savings account. It could be an investment account, a Roth IRA, a high yield checking account. There are a lot of different accounts that people have, and they can tap into them for different reasons. This survey doesn't ask about any of these. It also overlooks financial psychology and strategy, and it creates a false impression of financial frailty. People treat their money differently based on experience and emotions and personal financial strategy, and some people don't touch their savings simply because that gives them peace of mind. Others reserve it for major emergencies and handle smaller expenses from their monthly budget. These aren't signals of financial stress, they're strategic choices. But here's the problem. When we hear stats like only 41% of Americans can cover a $1,000 emergency, we tend to think that the other 59% have no safety net whatsoever. And that's simply not true. Many Americans have retirement accounts, whether it's through an employer-sponsored plan, or a Roth IRA, or an investment account, or a checking account, or other accounts that they could otherwise turn to. They're just not labeled a savings account, or they're earmarked as long-term rather than a short-term fund. But when we hear this stat, it tends to draw a line in the sand between those who are doing well financially and those who are completely doomed. It's a bit like nutrition. If we see a food that's labeled low calorie or high in protein, we tend to assume that the food itself overall is healthy. In this situation, we're seeing a reverse halo effect. If we think that somebody isn't paying for a $1,000 emergency from a savings account, we tend to assume that they are not stable financially, and that's just not necessarily the case. And this last one is really important. It uses language that shapes perception. This one is huge. Terms like couldn't afford or don't have an emergency fund get repeated constantly when the media references this survey. But the survey never even uses those words. What the survey asks is how somebody would cover a $1,000 emergency, not whether or not they could afford it. In fact, Bankrate's own summary says that 59% of Americans cannot afford a $1,000 emergency. But that's not even what they ask. They're inferring financial incapacity based on payment choice. This kind of misrepresentation may not be intentional, may not be, but still, it's inaccurate based on the literal wording of the survey. It's sensational because it's designed to provoke concern and urgency, and it's potentially harmful because it paints an overly dire picture and fuels discouraging narratives that make people feel like they are failing financially. And once this interpretation hits the headlines, all nuance is lost. The public perception shifts based on data that isn't even representative of what the survey asked. So who should we really be concerned about? Probably those who say they would need to borrow the money from family or friends, or those who say they would need to take out a personal loan, and maybe even those who say that they would reduce spending, but that last one, that's a bit of a gray area still. Cutting back in spending might just be smart budgeting, not a sign of distress. Many people prefer to alter their spending rather than tap into savings. And if you're proactive with your choice to reduce your spending, well, that's just a smart financial strategy, not a sign of distress. So at most, we're looking at 31% of Americans, or it certainly could be less, who are in a situation where they wouldn't be able to afford a small but urgent expense. And this is still a number that we want to pay attention to, but it's absolutely a far cry from saying most Americans can't afford a $1,000 emergency. So why does this survey get so much attention? Well, it's because it's headline gold. It is punchy, it's relatable, and importantly, it's scary. And Bankrate knows that. Bankrate is a respected financial publisher with smart, experienced researchers. They understand that the survey captures behavioral preferences and not necessarily financial capacity. And still, knowing how this question gets used and shared and misrepresented, Bankrate still chooses to include it in their survey every single year. But here's an important piece of the puzzle to remember. Bankrate is a business, and their business model is built around affiliate marketing and lead generation. They want to drive people to their site and click on links embedded within their articles and see advertisements on their pages. That is how they make money, so they know how to drive traffic to their site. To be clear, the data isn't wrong, but the framing and the way it's amplified in the media often leads to oversimplified takeaways that lose all nuance. And that is really important to keep in mind, because when data gets overly simplified into a fear-based soundbite, it stops informing people and just discourages them. And before we go any further, it's important to understand how this data was actually collected. Bankrate's 2025 Emergency Savings Report was conducted by SSRS using a probability-based online panel. Participants were randomly selected to reflect the U.S. population, but the survey was still completed online, and respondents were likely paid small incentives. It was more rigorous than in previous years, but the results still have to be interpreted in the context of they're a signal of what the population has going on, but not a complete picture. This matters because who participates in a survey tends to shape the results we get. And those who do online surveys in exchange for small financial compensation tend to be low to middle income earners. Middle, upper middle, and higher income households are not likely to be represented in this data simply because they're not motivated by a $3 survey payout, so they don't usually spend time on these type of sites. I wanted to address this because every time I post videos about investing, retirement, or financial planning, I get the same kind of comments. Things like, only 40% of people can afford a $1,000 emergency, so no one's saving for retirement, or no one's investing, everyone's broke, don't you know no one can afford a $1,000 emergency? That type of thinking isn't just wrong, it's harmful. It's so fear-based that it discourages people from even trying, and it paints the whole financial landscape with a very broad brush. My whole goal with this channel is to educate, and sometimes that involves correcting an oversimplified misrepresentation of data. So next time you hear that only 41% of Americans can afford a $1,000 emergency, pause and ask yourself, is that what the data actually says? Or is that just a headline meant to make you feel like you're failing? Because the truth of the matter is, many Americans can handle the financial shock. They're just not doing it the way the survey framed it. What are your thoughts on this one? Leave them in a comment down below. I post new videos every single week. If you got anything at all out of this one, please give it a like. If you're new here, please consider subscribing. Or if you know of someone who might get something out of this type of content, please consider sharing. I'll see you soon. Bye. Stop making noise. Seriously, my neighbor is cutting his lawn right now, and I definitely think you can hear it because it's like 10 feet away. I'll just take a break for a little bit. I wanted to say one more thing. This kind of misrepresentation may not be intentional. I don't know.